Without much ado, I'm going to pass the baton to Rick. We will introduce our honorable, speaker, Greg Johnson. Rick, please take it away.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, everyone, for joining this evening. Apologize for the technical difficulties. My pleasure to introduce my long colleague, acquaintance, Mr. Greg Johnson, who's the CEO of Webcheck Security, and they're based in the Utah, Salt Lake area. I've known Greg for a number of years prior to his tenure starting Webcheck Security. And one of the reasons why we curated this topic today was just not to talk about the technical aspects of penetration testing, which we've all had good presentations on before. One of the things that Greg, in my opinion, is particularly good at is translating the penetration test findings into a security management framework. So one of the things we're going to touch on today in Greg's application is the culture of security, looking at tales from the crypt, if you will, not just going over some of the same technical things, but really looking at, well, what are some of the subtle differences that supported the success of the Solarwinds hack? API security, how do you take information and communicate it not just to the technical subject matter experts, but to the board and the other executive stakeholders that need to answer the question, so what? Looking at key performance metrics and indicators, not just giving someone, a 200-page report full of, technical stuff that, are going to be able to check the box from a pen test perspective. So that's really the value that Webcheck Security brings from a methodology and a framework perspective. So without any further ado, Greg, welcome to the Silicon Valley chapter of our group, and happy to have you here this evening. So take it away.
Well, hey, side note, folks, if you want to ask Greg a question, type your question in the Q&A, and Rick is going to monitor those as we go.
Exactly. So
that's good, Rick. And if you want, we can do some of the questions. We've got some time here tonight, so if we want to answer some of the questions as we go, that would be great too. That way we won't get to the end and have to kind of cut people off.
Yeah, so, exactly. So again, to John's point, anyone has any questions, go ahead and post them into the chat. And once I get, a couple of 2 or 3, then I'll raise my hand with Greg and we'll answer those in kind.
Well, thanks, Rick, for that introduction. I've known Rick for many years. I've served him in several different capacities with different risk and compliance organizations, primarily focused around PCI. Rick is a PCI guru and has been for many years now for global payments. It's been really fun to watch him kind of ascend the ranks there and manage some global programs with service providers and be the compliance guru in the organization. Rick's just a stand-up guy. And it's always fun when I get to the Bay Area to do breakfast or lunch with him, and we've had some good associations over the years. So thank you again, Rick, for that nice introduction. And folks, I hope that there's some value here today for you. I think there might be a little bit. We're going to talk about a number of things, and I'll get into that in a minute. The first thing you should know is that there is hope, guys. I got my COVID shot today. And as you can see, I'm not that old. But in Utah, if you're 50 or above, starting Monday, which was yesterday, you were able to schedule your COVID shot. So my wife and I did. We went online. We went to Walmart and scheduled it. And so I ended up getting the Johnson & Johnson shot, which only requires 1 shot, at 10:30 a.m. this morning. So there is hope. This COVID thing's going to go away. I'm feeling a little bit tired and woozy tonight, but so Rick, you may need to play some music or something to wake me up if I start droning on and repeating myself and doing weird stuff. Okay.
Okay, we'll throw you a softball. Keep you going.
Okay, fantastic. Well, so and if any of you, you hear of Californians and taxes and leaving. If any of you want to come to Utah, just reach out, because my wife is a realtor and she'll find you something for half the price of what you have now, but double the square footage. So we'd love to have you here. Well, that aside, folks, it is an honor to be here tonight. Rick asked that the first thing we do is put Webcheck security in context a little bit by sharing what we do, if that's all right, and kind of how this company evolved. So I'd like to do that tonight. And then we'll dive into some fun and relevant topics, one of them being the Solarwinds Orion hack. And it just so happens that some of our practitioners are ex-NSA, and they've come up with a list of some very interesting things that organizations can do surrounding that. And Rick, I'm presuming that they're all going to get a copy of this presentation. Is that right?
Absolutely. If you provide it to us, we can go ahead and post that up in our portal.
Fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll PDF it. There's some relevant links here tonight and some different different things, different sites to go to, different tools we'll be talking about for code review and some other things. And so hopefully there's some value, and I'll make sure that I get that to you. Remind me if I forget tomorrow. I should have done it already. So I've been very fortunate, folks, in my long career. And when I say long, I wish we were in a room tonight and I could just see by raise of hands how many of you installed NetWare 3.5, right? I was a sales rep for Novell and WordPerfect in the day. And so now I'm kind of dating myself. And I suspect there's a few people in the room, Rick, that have done that as well, and remember the good old days. But along the way, I've been able to rub shoulders with some really fantastic consultants and practitioners. I've been able to learn enough about technology and later cybersecurity when I joined Security Metrics in 2006. And I think that's where I met you, Rick. I've been fortunate enough to learn the cyber and the compliance and risk ecosystem. So as Rick pointed out tonight, this is not a real deep dive technical presentation, although I'm going to share enough to be dangerous tonight. But I'm more of a cyber generalist and understand the ecosystem of cybersecurity. And so with that in mind, some time ago, well, not that long ago, in 2018, I realized that I understood penetration testing and scoping and where it fits in compliance frameworks better than a lot of people that are out there selling those kinds of solutions, and that I could form a company that could provide better penetration testing services at a more equitable price, and to do it with what we call the CX component. And I'll address that in a minute. So Webcheck Security started on that premise. And one of the ways I was able to start it is that one of those wonderful people that I met along the way, and truly success in your business, it's about the relationships you have. And Kurt Jepson, who you see on the screen, he's been the guy that has been my right-hand man. I met Kurt in about 2013, 2014. And he's been doing work for me ever since. We started doing some he started doing contract pen testing. I found that here was a dude that not only was he an Eagle Scout growing up, but he went into the Marine Corps. But the guy can talk to people like there's no tomorrow. He can diffuse angry situations. I've never seen someone able to talk with a client about a pen test when they think they know better than Kurt, and to bring all of the facts in a calm way, and in a way that says, hey, client, I care about you and I'm trying to do this to make you better. So he's kind of been the cornerstone that we built this practice on. He trains all of the practitioners. He reviews their reports until we can take the training wheels off and make sure they're up to snuff with Webcheck security, what we call the Webcheck way. But Kurt is one of those that he's not only a CISSP, and there are many of you in the room that are CISSPs tonight, but he's actually been a CISO at several organizations, VP of Technology at United Online. He has his Offensive Security Certified Professional, or OSCP certification. He's had PCI certifications. He's an engineer in Google and AWS. I've never met anyone like Kurt who could go up and down the stack and yet talk at a C level and yet identify a Samba problem or a Linux or Apache server problem and actually put his hands on, get dirty, roll up his sleeves and do things. So that's Kurt. And so I've been very fortunate to have smart people to help me to build this business. In fact, so much so that I wrote a book this past summer that came out surrounding web application security. But a lot of the scripts and the things that are in that book, there's a script on web application testing that came from Kurt. So I need to give credit where credit's due. I wrote about frameworks and applicability and some other things, and about threat hunting, having come from also a threat hunting company for the past couple of years prior to founding Webcheck Security. But fundamentally, I stand on the shoulders of giants. So we were excited to have our book come out and give us a little bit of credibility. But fundamentally, what Webcheck Security started to evolve into was a world-class penetration testing company. We realized that we could do not only external testing, but internal with a proprietary box that Kurt built that would also allow us to do Wi-Fi. And of course, web app testing. We do more web app testing than anything else. It's just pervasive. It's ubiquitous. Every SaaS company has to have a penetration test to show their clients because the clients ask. Not to mention NIST and ISO 27001 and PCI and HITRUST and many of the frameworks essentially demand that. But along the way, we also realized that several of our guys really enjoyed doing social engineering. And it's one thing to, as you know, purchase KnowBe4, which is a great product, and there's a lot of products out there. But it really hits home when you can craft a crafty program, not necessarily to catch people, but to educate them and make them better. So we found that we do a lot of call campaigns and phishing, and we also have a guy that can break into any safe in North America or data center. And so we will do physical surveillance and physical pen testing as well. So that's a fun element of what Webcheck Security does. We've got some fun stories. I might share some of those with you tonight. But fundamentally, as we started dealing with our clients back in 2019 and then more pronounced in 2020, we realized a couple of things. That there were two critical things that our clients really wanted. First of all, a lot of them were just asking, hey, we really don't know where we're at. What's our cyber hygiene? And so we developed a maturity assessment to give clients not only a risk score, but a maturity score, which are always converse. As the risk comes down, the maturity comes up. And base that on the framework that is appropriate to them. Now that might be CIS 20 if they're not beholden to PCI, ISO, HITRUST, NIST, or other things. CIS 20 is a very good digestible framework, especially for smaller organizations. And so we started doing a lot of these roadmaps for better cyber posture, but we found, especially in smaller organizations, well, and I'll just phrase it this way, 80% of the corporations in America don't have a CISO. And so we realized that a lot, and our clients were asking for some governance and some help. And sometimes even when they did have a CISO or director of security or security practitioners, they needed augmentation with their risk and compliance. So we developed our FISO practice, which is Fractional Information Security Officer, where we take guys like Kurt, who not only have their CISSP, but have actually governed and been CISOs in organizations. We have another gentleman who ran the security at REI, for example, for some time, and is now a CISO at another organization, but lends his time as he's pretty flexible in his schedule. So I've been very fortunate to have run into great people and built great relationships so that we can have them deliver these services. So governance, vendor audits, which I'm sure some of you have dealt with in your careers, they can be annoying. And it takes a lot of time to fill those things out. And sales is banging on the security organization saying, hey, we got to have this, or we can't sell this contract. And so we find that augmentation in that area has been a really good service for our clients. So really, that's what Webcheck security is all about. It started with pen testing, but it's evolved into maturity assessments and our fractional information security service. Now, along the way, there have been other breakoffs of that, organizations that need help with PCI. We have a vulnerability scan portal with an online self-assessment questionnaire. I'm a PCIP. I understand the ecosystem, so I do a lot of free calls. I love serving people. I love serving merchants and service providers and large organizations, help them better understand the PCI environment, or de-scope them, if you will. Most people don't understand PCI. Rick gets it because he's been eating, breathing, and sleeping it for many years, as have I. But most corporations don't understand how to correlate the PCI Council's data security standard with Visa, who really drives things, and then MasterCard inserts some of their requirements, and the whole ecosystem of acquiring banks, processors, and ISOs. But we get that, and we can help them to navigate to where they're really supposed to be, rather than full PCI scope if it's not applicable. We also have done some other things. We have some managed threat hunting, some ex-NSA folks, which I'll talk about again a little bit later on, that can come in and help with forensics. So we do forensic investigations, and we also have our NSA analysts can do a virtual SOC and offer managed threat hunting and monitoring services. So that's what we're all about at Webcheck Security. Now on to some of the fun stuff here tonight. If I can get my screen here to change, there we go. So tonight's topics, we're gonna cover a number of things here. So I hope that's not too much, but I want to talk about app security, not only from a penetration test point of view and developing a culture of cybersecurity, but more focused on DevSecOps. And then share some tales from the pen test crypt. What are we finding? What are the common things that repeat themselves? I thought it might be appropriate to refresh our memories on what are the OWASP top 10 and where can we find them? And then talk about some other concepts like code review. I thought it would also be fun to review some key components of the Solarwinds Orion attack. One of those is, I don't know if any of you have ever attended the InfraGard meetings or an FBI briefing, but I hadn't attended an FBI briefing until several years ago. And my eyes were open. I thought, yeah, sure, I know Iran's hacking us. I know Russia and China are hacking us. But I think the American public has no idea. And I've got some data I want to share with you tonight that I think will be interesting. And then we'll refresh what's Orion, what's SolarWinds, what really happened. And then some of my ex-NSA friends provided some remediation tactics and prevention tactics. And I thought that might be of interest tonight. Rick, are we on track so far? Does that sound okay, or do I need
Absolutely.
to?
I think that's a good curated list. And we did have one softball question come in from the field, and that is, take away any best practices in the cloud container space. If you're doing an application pen test, what are the specifics, around that type of environment, and how people can look at, for their own career path, what knowledge gaps might exist, that would make one a better security practitioner, in dealing with that kind of hybrid, environment. So if through the course of the topics, we could touch on that. If you have any best practices to share, I think that would be of interest as well.
Oh, very good. And in fact, I think we'll talk to some of those things as we go on and talk more about pen testing and web application pen testing. But I will say this, when I get asked by college students, as well as by practitioners like many of yourselves that say, I would really love to get into penetration testing, particularly web app pen testing. It's one thing, as you know, guys, to run a Nessus scan and an Nmap and find vulnerabilities and do some research and try to exploit them externally. or even internally, but it's a whole different ball game altogether when you're starting to think with a developer's cap on and you understand a little bit of JavaScript and PHP and Python and maybe some C# and some of the common languages. And you start talking about things like input validation on fields and fuzzing inside of an application and all the different components. Kurt says that he uses sometimes 100 tools on a full service application test that involves internal and external infrastructure as well as the app. And anyway, we'll get into that. But here's what I want to say is that if you're interested in learning more about it, one of the best things you can do is to get your offensive security certified professional. Now, that particular certification doesn't, as I understand it, focus solely or even maybe heavily on web application security. But what it does is it causes you to, in a short period of time, have to hack into a certain environment that's set up by the Kali organization that runs that and become a problem solver. So we know at Webcheck Security, for example, Kurt will say, hey, listen, let's not engage with pen testers unless they've had lots of experience or they're an OSCP. Because he says, I know if they're an OSCP or they're working on getting it, that I can groom them and train them and they'll be a good web app pen tester, which I find is interesting. So all that to say, get your OSCP and then start learning a high-end wonderful tool like Burp Suite, which is one of the, it's one of our preferred tools, and there are other tools like Zap, but that helps to begin to help you understand some of the possibilities when you're testing an application. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, and please feel free to answer or to ask more questions. Let's talk about, first of all, then cybersecurity and pen testing, and really what is a pen test. Now, most people in the room know what a pen test is, so my apologies if this seems kind of banal to some of you, but there are many MSPs, so managed service providers, and IT personnel that confuse vulnerability scanning with penetration testing. And the way I've always liked to define a penetration test is a real world, simulated real world attack conducted by a certified and experienced engineer that uses both automated and manual techniques, and then documents very carefully what's done following the exploits to the end. So in other words, if you run a scan, or even if you authenticate into an application and you run Burp Suite, you'll have a set of results, but some of them will be false positives. Some of them will be exploits that once you exploit, it will peel the onion layer and lead to something else that needs to be identified as well. It may lead to root access of the server that it's running on. And then you need to get into that server and say, well, what else can we exploit here? That's very important. So it's important to understand what a pen test is. Now, the reason is because in a culture of cybersecurity, truly effective SaaS companies, banks, fintech, or any company will have an annual pen test. If they're SaaS companies, what I'm finding, what we've seen at Webcheck, is that they're being asked by their clients to do more than one pen test a year, because these clients know that code gets deployed, and their cybersecurity practitioners in those organizations know that with code constantly changing, that unless an organization is constantly pen testing, that the opportunity to have vulnerabilities in the software, it can always be introduced. So we're finding more and more that cyber conscious organizations, as part of their best practices, have at least an annual pen test. Now, as Rick can attest, for many years, the frameworks like PCI, which really came from NIST, have always said that you need to pen test at least annually, or as frequently as there are major code revisions. So in the payment card industry, if a payment card module, for example, of some code is updated, it theoretically it should be pen test, but because of cost and expense and time and resources, companies just kind of, they don't do it, and they'll show their QSA. Oh yeah, here's the report. We get a pen test every year, and usually the auditor passes them. May not always be effective though. So anyway, some things we've discovered about pen testing that I wanted to share here today as part of a best practice. We believe, as I said earlier, that the CX should be part of the experience. And what I mean by that is the customer experience. It's not appropriate for us to hire pen testers that won't be customer facing. Why? Because first of all, there needs to be careful scoping and reconfirmation. I usually scope the jobs because I understand that. But when we get with customers, we find that things have changed. You know what? We only want to test our sandbox or our dev environment, or we've just put a new build in place and we've split the app into two pieces. And so we need you to test both of them. So we find that good pen testing and best practices pen testing starts with very careful scoping and reconfirmation of the client scope. We also ask our pen testers to go the extra mile. In other words, we want them to do reconnaissance. Don't just start testing them and scanning them. Go out on GitHub and Pastebin and see if you can find their code and get access to it. See if you can find on social media email addresses and login usernames that you might be able to escalate privileges with, or that they might want to be concerned with. So we do those things. We also find that effective documentation is really an important part of it. I was once a vice president of business development with a large compliance company, and they'll remain unnamed, but they did an internal pen test and they used a contractor, and this pen tester was really good. But what he did is he pivoted to an internal segment of the network that was supposedly off limits. And he reported on it, but he couldn't recreate how he'd done it. He didn't have sufficient screenshots. He didn't carefully document how he got there. And that's no bueno, right? It was embarrassing. I remember being on the call and having to explain to the client of that particular compliance company that, hey, you know, we got in, but we can't tell you how. It was embarrassing. So we find that a best practices pen test will have conscientious and highly effective documentation, screenshots, scripts, recreation of what happened, but yet not too much information. So we find that most customers want, tell us what's medium, high, or critical so that we can fix it, but then put in an appendix every port you scanned, every port that was open, all of the low level or informational things in the app, and then we'll look at them or fix them when we get to them, if they even make sense. So there's kind of a stratification of good pen test documentation as well, where the meat is what they really need to know, but a careful, detailed appendix will provide more information that might be helpful later on, if that makes sense. And then finally, one of the things that we discovered needs to be an effective part of a best practices pen test is effective remediation environment. So we always get on the phone with the client to debrief that pen test, to work them through what might be irrelevant findings. So, you know, and I don't know if I can think of a great example here, but let's say that there was an input validation error, an injection error of some sort on a particular portion of a web application. But the client points out, well, only the authenticated administrator would have that particular problem visible. So in that sense, it's probably not an issue in this application. So there's context, right, with everything. Cybersecurity is not just about plowing forward with frameworks and book written things. It's also about context and getting business done and business KPIs as well. So we try to balance that with our clients. Well, all that to say, clients, as part of a culture of web application or just security, need to have, as part of their InfoSec policies, at least an annual penetration test every year, and then quarterly scans at least every quarter, both internally and externally. And with web applications, there are different tools that probably should be employed. Well, so here's some of those tales from the crypt. First, before I go into this, kind of a fun story. The first time I ever hired Kurt to do a job, it was a contract job. We were trying him out. I was building a cyber practice at another company. Rick, this was right after I left Security Metrics. I had an opportunity to build a cyber practice at a development firm. And Kurt had come on the radar, and he calls me all excited, and he says, "Greg, I'm just one keystroke away from downloading their database." And he'd found a SQL injection error that allowed him to do that. So is web application testing important? Yes, it is. Actually, he didn't download the database. We don't do bad stuff when we test. In fact, AWS, when you're testing in their cloud, same thing with Azure or Google, you can't do DDoS attacks. You can't do things that would take them down. We throttle back fuzzing and some of the things that we do. But anyway, that was a funny story. He was so excited. And conversely, the pen testers get depressed when they find secure apps and secure infrastructures. It's like, this wasn't any fun. We couldn't bust anything. They were too good. Another story that I wanted to share with you, and this has to do with network segmentation. As Rick knows, in the PCI industry, for years, the card brands, the acquiring banks, and of course the PCI Council have tried to educate all those that take credit cards or process credit cards that you need to take the credit card apparatus, and by that I mean the entire network segment, and put it on its own. Nobody should have access to it. It shouldn't be able to call out. That's because things are vulnerable and things can get hacked through vulnerable things. So you think of the old Target story where the bad actors got in through the HVAC system. Well, we were doing a law firm, and on their external pen test, which typically external penetration tests you don't find a lot in this day and age. We've gotten wiser to cybersecurity, and Palo Alto and Fortinet firewalls have gotten better and better. But he found one of these internal camera systems that was communicating out through the internet. Kurt found he was able to access that camera system and take pictures of their boardroom and their filing cabinet. Now, he tests from his Manhattan lab, and this was a law firm, I believe, in Utah. And yet he was able to take pictures of their boardroom. Well, they were horrified, and of course we taught them how to put in some appropriate access controls, or ACLs, so that the camera system wouldn't be part of their other network segments. So those are some fun things, and from time to time we tend to find things like that. One more fun story. A lot of times it's of course a best practice to do internal testing as well. And well, actually, I'll tell this in a minute. Let me get on with the web application. So we find in almost every web app test we do, these are two things that are very common: cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, which is one of the OWASP top 10, and also SSL flags not set when change password pages are returning the user ID, and then you can capture the session ID or the current password. And I could have gone on with this list. One thing is insecure cookie handling, where you can jump in and at a session that you're not supposed to. So we find these things in almost every web application test that we do. So the question is a DevSecOps mentality important? Is building a culture into the development process and the testing process important? Yes, it is, because we're finding these things all the time. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that when we get to code review. Some other things that we find, external tests, unnecessary ports open. So the camera system that we hacked into, essentially that should not have been available or should have had multi-factor authentication or other maybe VPN access only, but it didn't. And we were able to get in and do things that bad actors might have taken advantage of. This has led to many full compromises. Other things that we commonly find now, an internal pen test, of course, is a behind the firewall test. And there are a number of ways to do that. In the old days, a lot of pen test companies would actually send somebody to the organization and have them granted some access and then just start poking around. Now, the reason you do that, and the reason that's a best practice, is because if a hacker did get in, what would he find, right? And so it's always good to find those low-hanging fruit before a bad actor can. Not only that, but sometimes bad actors are the employees themselves. And so you want to be able to find things. For example, where it says captured password hashes, weak passwords, we find a lot of these, even in today's day and age. It's amazing what we still find on internal pen tests. Well, Kurt was doing a test a year ago where he found that with using one of his, I believe it was Nikto or John the Ripper, he found that the password going into the executive assistant, Sally's HR server, he was able to crack it. And he was able to get into social security numbers, C-suite salaries, obviously stuff that you don't want people seeing. And so through the penetration test, they were able to, of course, change their policies, fix those passwords. But we're finding that quite a bit. I didn't say much here about Wi-Fi, but we, typically, well, let me back up. So no longer do you have to send a guy or a gal to sit in a boardroom and behind the firewall at the corporation. This can be done by shipping a box. We have a proprietary box that we ship, or we can also have them install a VM that does a download of a specific build of the Kali Linux tools that we use, and through which we're able to tunnel some of our other tools like Burp Suite and OpenVOS and other tools that the guys and gals use when they pen test. It's up to the organization which one makes the most sense. Some organizations don't have the resources or expertise to configure VMware or Hyper-V, which are the VM environments that will run our tools on. They're secure. They create a reverse SSH shell back to the tester. It dials home, if you will, and then the client is in charge. They can pull the plug at any time. We give them our IP addresses so they can tell that it's the white hat engineer that's testing them and not a bad actor. But we can also ship a box that also has a Wi-Fi antenna. So that Wi-Fi antenna can search for rogue SSIDs, but also try to capture hashes from those Wi-Fi systems as well. And then, of course, report on whether or not they're running WEP instead of WPA2 and better encryption protocols. This slide is from a real story. I went to a hotel at a trade show in Baltimore, and hopefully you can see this, but I bent over the counter and I was astounded that it said, if the computer shuts down, the password is password. Now they used a funky @ sign and an exclamation point, but I included this mainly for your benefit, Rick, because as you know, the PCI industry for years with hotels that were getting breached constantly and still do, were pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to stop these kinds of hacks. And yet here's an example of why it happens right there. So I just thought you'd get a kick out of that if I could show you that. I actually snuck behind the counter and had to take a picture of that, and I use it in some of my presentations. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is, so as you're developing a a culture of DevSecOps, which is not just security operations. It's as these developers are building web applications, it's one thing to test and to find the problems, but these are things that can be discovered during the process, and it just leads to better practice. Now, I'll be honest, it takes time and resources, and we do code review at Webcheck Security, but dang it, it's expensive. It's a lot more expensive than a pen test because you've got, there are scanners, but it's mostly a manual process, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So there are a couple things I've chosen to focus on tonight. One is development security training. Now, developers are, they're busy. They're coding, they're developing operational things, things that work, things that run things that go, things that do. And it's hard to stop and think about all of the security problems that one might have as they're coding a particular component. Well, key concepts such as input validation, documentation of code, extraneous and inefficient calls to insecure objects. These are all things that developers can forget. It's easy to do. And so one of the things that we recommend, and many of the frameworks recommend, is that organizations need to have yearly, if not more frequently, security awareness training for developers. Now, this is not the security awareness training, obviously, that you do with your employees that says, don't click on this bad link. But it would be training that's done by a guy like Kurt or my other associate, Seth Law, who is a code reviewer, and they would come in and actually talk about some of the top 20 things and how to avoid them. The MITRE organization, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the MITRE attack framework in threat hunting. But MITRE has cataloged almost 700 different kinds of software weaknesses in their CWE project. And these are all the different ways that developers can screw up and they lead to vulnerabilities. Some of them are very subtle. I'm always amazed at how Kurt and Cade and Jeremy and some of our pen testers, they love ripping into apps and they find stuff, right? Well, DevSec training is a way to minimize or at least reduce those vulnerabilities that get baked right into the code, right? So that's an important concept to realize. Another important concept, again, is that of code review. Now, there are a lot of tools, and every organization should use a code review tool if they are building a culture of DevSecOps and good cybersecurity. And if, of course, if they have a development environment. And the reason is a lot of those tools are free. There's so many of them out there. I was amazed. I think I've included a table. Actually, I didn't, but I think I may have listed some of them. But if you go to the OWASP.org, for example, it lists all of the possibilities, and some of them cost money, some of them don't. But in a kind of the lowest common denominator, if organizations would just at least run code review tools prior to pushing to production and prior to having pen tests, they would come out a lot better. One of the differences between just a code review tool and an actual code reviewer is that human reviewers can fill in the blind spots where automated tools simply don't check. So very similar to a pen test, you kind of peel the onion layer and realize that if this, then that piece of code may also be insecure as well. All right, so moving on, here is the link. And again, I'll provide this presentation to Rick to get out to the group. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but there's some great source code analysis tools. Dozens of them are open source. The table that is on this particular page lists some companies that you might be familiar with: Veracode and White Hat and Beyond Security. You've heard of those, but also HCL, Blue Closure, Synopsys, Checkmarks, Deep Source, Micro Focus, which used to be Novell, or Micro Focus bought Novell, and of course GitLab. But beyond that, OWASP has their own tools, and there are a dozen other companies that have code review scanners. So if any of you are developing or training developers, or you talk to the developers in your organization, I suggest that you share this with them. So
Hey,
hopefully
Greg,
that, go ahead.
just a quick question coming in from a question regarding, and this goes back to taking key performance indicators of a penetration test suite, and rather than just generating tons of technical data and reporting, looking at how we communicate that back to business leaders. If from the board's perspective, answer the question, so what? What is your opinion on other frameworks? You mentioned MITRE from a technical perspective, but what about the factor analysis for information risk, the FAIR? Have you heard of the open FAIR standard?
Yeah,
And
I
is
have.
that something that is, generating some white noise? Is that a best practice, or is that something that, has some promise to it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'm not an expert in that, but I worked with a practitioner, Matt Sorensen, great guy, who was a lawyer and a cybersecurity practitioner. So he specialized in cyber law, but he didn't like the billable hours, so he left cyber law to become a CISO. And when I was working for managed detection response company Secuvant, Matt and I were there together, and he started doing a lot of research into the FAIR methodology and started to adopt that. In fact, I believe there's some certifications that you can get surrounding that. I believe that any framework that helps you to communicate to executives scores and KPIs, most executives don't want a ton of detail, but they want to understand where they're at. And sometimes it's hard when you're a cybersecurity practitioner, when you're just getting on the pulpit and trying to say, here's where we're at. Well, if you can use objective standards and objective KPIs to help make your point, then that's a much better message. Well taken. But if I may, let me share another thought. Over the years that I've been providing outsourced CISOs to organizations, what we've found is that in most organizations, the reason why, or one of the reasons why, there's a disconnect. Well, first of all, the C-suite and business owners or founders often don't believe that cybersecurity is their problem, which it is. They believe it's an IT problem. And so it's hard to sometimes educate to that. However, one of the things that we found is very helpful is forming a cybersecurity committee in an organization, of which at least the CFO or COO is a part, hopefully the CEO, but there's got to be a C-suite member on that committee. So whether you use FAIR or whether you use any other kind of a framework, or you're borrowing from MITRE, having a cybersecurity committee that has eyes from the C-suite, they will start to get it and understand. And if you don't have that in an organization, it's really hard to be successful, if that makes sense. Anything else there, Rick?
No, I think you nailed it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So before we leave the web application and we get into in the remaining minutes here to some of the SolarWinds stuff, most of you have probably seen this. It's constantly evolving, but the number one thing at the top of the OWASP top 10, the Open Web Application Security Project, is injection. And a lot of that just simply has to do with field validation. Now, here's another difference between a scan and a pen test. When our pen testers test, we will typically do what most frameworks call an authenticated test. So we'll do black box, where we'll go out and we'll just kind of hit it blind, and we'll see if anything can be broken, see if we can break in. But it's always a best practice to get into the application and really start looking at the worn out, fuel injectors and pistons and finding stuff. And we find that, well, so the point is that good pen testers will do field by field input validation of everything, right? And they will use some scans to do that, but they'll test and they'll fuzz and they'll try different credentials, and that's where injection comes in. It continues to be the #1 problem. The security of cybersecurity that of web app or DevSecOps that we talked about earlier, doing code review and DevSecOps training on a yearly basis would reduce that significantly. But injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, XML, external entities, broken access control, security misconfiguration, cross-site scripting, insecure deserialization, using components with known vulnerabilities and insufficient logging and monitoring. This doesn't often get tested, by the way, this last one, with web applications. But it is critical to understand if you're running a web app, whether you're running it at an AWS and you're using Cloudflare or you're running it on-prem, do you have technology that's not only logging, but alerting to unauthorized accesses and even attempts? Because if somebody from the Ukraine is trying to break into your web application and it's denied, you want to know that, and you probably want to block that IP at the firewall level. So otherwise, by, think cross correlation here, they're probably trying other things in other elements of your organization. So that's an important one to keep in mind. All right. I wanted to share some details with you that I think you'll be interested in. First of all, do nation states attack us? The answer is yes. I went to an FBI briefing a couple of years ago, and I was just blown away at what not only Iran and North Korea are doing, but China. So China has, and I've got reams of official FBI documents that I'd be happy to share with any of you that talk about the tactics, the strategies, the goals. And there is really a program, the 4 R's, where China is seeking by 2025 to rip off, reintroduce, reinnovate, and replace. And then I've attached this story that a US semiconductor or superconductor company had sold a Chinese firm a wind turbine design. Anyway, within 6 years, that Chinese company was producing a similar turbine and cut all ties with the US manufacturer, and they started to dominate the market. And this is just one story. It happens time and time and time again. And I was just amazed at how they do it, how they infiltrate our organizations. Sometimes they do it with money. There was a guy in Utah, church-going guy with a family, a little down on his luck, was having problems with bills and payments. And he was an engineer, was a former Army guy that had high up contacts. Somehow, the Chinese government got a hold of him with an operative and helped him pay some debts. So he started leaking US secrets to the Chinese. And so this stuff is real. Here's some other interesting things that you might not have heard of. So there is this plan in English. It's called the Made in China 2025 plan. And it lists 10 domestic Chinese industries in which China seeks to significantly basically dominate and cut its reliance on foreign produced technology. And it's focusing these specific 10 industries: computer numerical control machines and tool robotics, aerospace equipment, electric power equipment, marine engineering equipment and high-tech ships, agricultural equipment, advanced rail transportation equipment, new materials, energy efficient and new energy automobiles, biomedicine, and high performance medical instruments. Those are the specific industries that China has identified that they want to basically infiltrate, breach data, rip it off, and make it their own. So why do I bring that up. China is probably the most organized. They're the largest superpower with the hacking capabilities, and so they're a great example. But there's no question that what happened with the Orion, the SolarWinds Orion attack, that it was a nation state attack. So we know that it came from the Russians in this case, the second most organized superpower as it comes to hacking, and that it's a real threat. So I provide that just so that we're aware that it's not just, you know, college kids eating burritos in the dark and playing video games that are hacking. It's real nation states, and they're organized. So first of all, what is Orion? I think most of you know this. It's a remote management platform, and it is a platform. It does a number of things. It's designed to simplify IT administration, both on-prem, in the cloud, and in software as a service environments, to provide a single pane of glass. Well, basically, what our intelligence agencies told us is that the Russians had hacked the code that was deployed to update that platform, and so it was getting updated all over the U.S. with bad code. The code created a backdoor into their customers' information technology systems, and then that allowed the hackers to then install malware, which helped them to spy on companies and organizations. I don't know if you folks realize just how extensive that was. And I don't know, oh yeah, here it is. So I've included some of that data here, but there were over 18,000 companies, including Microsoft, FireEye, and the US Departments of Homeland Security, State, Commerce and Treasury, as well as the National Institutes of Health. And then this is the disturbing thing: nuclear programs run by the US Department of Energy and National Security Administration were also targeted. And then there's a link here. You'll find this interesting. The Department of Homeland Security found complete info on this. Now, I actually pulled this data about a month or two ago. So they're constantly adding supplemental data, and you'll find that when you go out to this this link. So here's a couple of thoughts. This really speaks to, and I don't know that there might have been some social engineering here. The point is, these guys were in SolarWinds systems for a long time, and they weren't discovered. If we were in a room and I were to say, hey, by raise of hands, who could tell me how long a hacker is in a system before they're discovered? We all know that it's at least 180 days. Depends on which research organization you talk to, Poneman, Forrester, Gartner, whatever, but they all say about the same thing, that a hacker's usually in the system for 6 months to a year before they were discovered. So they were in the SolarWinds system for a long time. Now, to SolarWinds' credit, they will get better, guys. You know, it's unfortunate their stock's gone down. There's been a lot of fallout from this. But the bottom line is they will get better. They will implement a better culture of cybersecurity. You better believe it. They'll look at their threat hunting and their monitoring. In other words, their SOC services. They'll look at the code review and code scanning, as well as penetration testing, in a way that they've never done so before. And clearly there were some gaps in that. Again, it's not my place to point the finger or judge, but clearly somewhere there were gaps in that culture of cybersecurity that allowed this breach to happen. Yeah.
I heard one question that someone had thought that the API security of the source code repository, that there was a failed or an invalid authentication attempt to some private key mechanism that was a toehold about how they were able to infiltrate that code base to begin with. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is that white noise, or is that just something that's more sensationalized kind of reporting?
You know, I haven't read that, and I don't know everything, Rick, but I can tell you that that is a common issue. Couple things. when we pen test, we always ask our clients, first of all, do you have an API? Because what the clients don't realize is that APIs can be hacked. In fact, we can do SQL injection attacks and many fun things through an API. The second thing is code repositories need to be secure. And that's why I have the guys go out and do reconnaissance before they even begin scanning and testing, because often you can get into code repositories. So yeah, Rick, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable and logical and common explanation as to what might have happened. I don't know.
Okay, one other follow-on question. Notwithstanding the specifics of the Solarwinds issue, but to the larger issue in DevSecOps, if a small enterprise or any size company has a very high cadence of release schedules, they're pushing to the cloud, they've got a huge, release train pipeline type of thing. How do you, from a culture, take a lot of these controls and provide the mandate back into the executive leadership so that the DevSecOps culture, the developers that think that they didn't have a problem to begin with, to make the time and investment in people and process to, at least provide, some incremental security there that's sustainable for the organization? I know that's a loaded question, but some opinions or takeaway there would be appreciated.
Sure, I'd be happy to give my opinion. It would have been fun to have Lori, one of my practitioners, or Kurt himself, because as practicing CISOs, they would have some really unique insight. And in fact, I'd be delighted for anyone who wants to set up a conversation to do that. But here's a couple things. One thing I'm going to reiterate is that organizations that don't have a cybersecurity committee that has a member of the C team or C-suite on that committee meeting on a frequent basis, like once a month, are going to have a hard time educating the C-suite about cadences of pen tests or anything else. One of our clients is a developer. They develop and run all of the contests for a very large convenience store chain in the United States. And every quarter, new contests come out. Clients have to log on to an app or a website, enter their personal data, so you're talking PII, and that could become a problem. So every quarter, this developer has us run a pen test on the next quarter's test that they're going to be deploying, or contest. Now, that's easy because I'm dealing directly with the CEO. It's a small organization. He's one of the founders, and that makes it easy. But I can see where, as a cybersecurity professional, even at a high level, you've got a CISSP, maybe you're a CISO. If you're not having open and honest dialogue on a consistent basis with the C-suite, they're not going to feel the ownership. Somehow the answer to that question, Rick, is they've got to feel ownership so that these principles can be inculcated into the organization. One of the things we like to do when we do maturity assessments is we like to have the CEO, CFO, or COO, whoever's most tasked with cybersecurity, be present on at least the kickoff meeting and one of the first interviews. They may be silent. It may not have anything to do with them other than we want them to understand the impact and the outcomes of the roadmaps that we'll be developing for them. So anyway, I hope those are a couple of concepts that help, but there's no magic pill here. It really has to be an open and consistent dialogue, and typically that can be done through a working committee that meets monthly that involves all disciplines, including HR, because they've got all the PII data in the organization. They're the ones that have the training enforcement. They're the ones that have the onboarding and offboarding that should be part of the InfoSec policy, right? So it has to be a good, well-rounded committee with all stakeholders, but especially the C-suite. Anyway, that's what I'd say. Okay, we're coming up on boy, I've been talking for a while, Rick, so I'm gonna just go over a couple of things really quickly here. So we have some ex-NSA folks that have Again, if you want to learn more, you can go to this cyber.dhs.gov. But I asked Marshall, one of our forensic folks and threat hunters, I said, how would you have remediated this? And there are a lot of different things that he said. And we don't have the time to go through all of it, resetting and re-imaging. But one of the things he said, if you look through your network logs and you find any device, meaning a server or a router, an app server, whatever the case may be, and it's called out to one of these, oops, I went too far here. Sorry about that. Let me go back. There we go. If it's called out to one of these domains, these are bad. Then perhaps it's being that device is being used as a command and control server. So I thought this would be an interesting resource to provide you. Some final thoughts on how this can be remediated. One of the things he said, and this is so easy to do, moving forward, he said, we strongly recommend using an intrusion detection system with the latest snort or Suricata signatures. Now, those are open source, guys. And he mentioned that FireEye has published these detection signatures. So if you can set up your own server to run snort or to run Suricata, you don't have to spend a lot of money to at least have some alerting going on as far as north-south traffic in your organization. There are also some excellent endpoint detection, EDR stuff out there. I think most of you have heard of SentinelOne, Sophos, and CrowdStrike. These are a lot different than good old Norton antivirus, aren't they? One of the reasons why our threat hunters love SentinelOne so much is it allows them to roll back individual workstations, not just server endpoints, but workstation endpoints to a particular point in time, wipe and eradicate malware in a way that is difficult with other products. But these are all good products. I run the risk of leaving things out, but these are probably one of the top three. And so if you're running these kinds of things on your organization, it's less likely that an attack like the SolarWinds attack would go unnoticed. Anyway, those were some of his thoughts. If anybody wants we wrote an article on this that I posted on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to send that to any of you. Well, those are the thoughts that I had tonight, folks. I hope there's been some value for some of you. I'd love to chat with you. You can just send me an email at getintouch@webchecksecurity.com. That will come to me and or the general manager. We'll make sure that somebody responds. I like to respond personally. Also, this URL, webchecksecurity.com/resources. Number of podcasts. We have a podcast called Vistas, which comes out a couple of times a month. We just started it. It's sponsored by a couple of well-known entities, and every week or every month we have CEOs, founders, or others talking about not only cybersecurity, but sometimes communication skills, because that's important in the cyber realm as well. You'll find some video resources, articles that we've written on the blog. So I'd encourage you to go out there and see if there's something that will be helpful to you. Anyway, I'm happy to take more questions or participate in the discussion. And thank you so much, Rick, for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Just one other follow-on question, and this goes back to security program management for a CISSP practitioner, more from, again, your comments around a career development perspective. What type of soft skills are usual and, makes people successful in being able to take technical documentation like this and provide that translation service to the executive or to the board?
Oh, I love that question. And I'll tell you why. I've recently gone through, and I'm going through, a coaching regimen. I hired a professional coach to help me to become a better listener and to connect better with people. And I think in cybersecurity, we tend to focus a lot on our technical skills, but we forget that there are some really important soft skills particularly when you are dealing with the C-suite, but not only that, everyone in the organization. How do you educate? How do you really connect with people? What I've come to learn is that developing a listening skill called intrinsic validation is one of the most phenomenal things that you can do. And what intrinsic validation says is, if I'm talking to you, Rick, it means I'm more interested in you than I am about me or getting my point across. I'm interested in understanding your point of view and validating you as a human being. And so but that's hard to practice. It takes a lot of time to develop that. And that's why I hired a coach, because I realized with my wife, with clients, I don't always listen so well. And so if one can learn to get themselves out of the way and focus on what others want, what they need, that doesn't mean they're right all the time. That doesn't mean that they get everything they want, but what it means is you are able to communicate at a deeper level and touch the communication sweet spot. Well, I would recommend that you go to our Vistas podcast. You can go to this resources page, and you'll see a new link called Vistas. Our last podcast, in fact, episode number 2, because we just started this this program. I interviewed Doug Stoddard, our executive coach, and he talks about some amazing principles. And I would just highly commend that to you. In fact, one of my clients, who is the VP of infrastructure and technology at a very large SaaS company that runs the gym software in, dozens of states, he heard the podcast and he contacted me and said, "Greg, I want to talk to your coach." How do I get in touch with him? So I would highly recommend that. It's framed by, hey, if you're a CISO, if you're in the cyber realm, it's all for naught if you can't communicate. And we kind of framed the whole podcast that way, and it's fantastic. Doug's an amazing guy. You'll really enjoy that episode. Hope that's helpful.
It is. That's great. Well, I think the questions have kind of trickled down now. I think I want to thank you, Greg, for your time and your engagement for the chapter membership. And let's certainly be able to post this up when you can present it to us in a PDF fashion. And Sunil or John, I think that'll conclude the presentation portion of our meet tonight, and I'll turn it back to one of you.